the streaming going? Oh, okay. Cool, cool. Thank you. Oh, okay, cool. Oh, more people come. Let's see what happens.
Check one, check two, mic check one, mic check two. Excellent.
Nice. Hi. How's it going?
Okay. How's it going for you?
Good, good. Thanks for coming.
I do have to tell you that my voice is not so strong.
Okay. No worries. No worries. Try to preserve.
I'm gonna try. How is everything? The schedule looks amazing. You guys did an amazing job.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Have you met folks yet?
I know Jimmy. Hi, Sahar. Hi, and I'm Ravisha.
Sahar is a faculty member in Asian American Studies
Oh, nice to
in
meet you.
sociology. Is a student, is a sophomore, student assistant
Nice to meet you.
in Capice. Ravisha is a faculty member in Child Adolescent Development at Object of Education. Also, distinguished faculty.
Oh.
Distinguished Service Award winner.
Oh, thanks. It's a little bit overwhelming, actually. Yeah. So that part is overwhelming.
Yeah.
Oh, very nice to meet you. But I'm not, I've always just done a lot of work behind the scenes, and so it's very strange to be the person who's photographed. I'm usually the one who's directing the photographer, like, take it this way or do that, as opposed to being in front of the camera. And that picture I had to take for the blog for all media is like the most awkward thing I've ever had to do. And I'm just like, I think I'm just. It was a campus photographer. It wasn't Bob, but it was someone that they typically contract with, and so but it was just like not something. Yeah, I'm not comfortable like saying like pose this way, try to be natural. I'm like, yeah. Other than the questions that you guys have?
Not really. No. Is there something you wanted to say?
Oh, no, no, no.
Oh,
Just
okay.
making sure that I'm comfortable the way that you'd like us to
Oh, no, no.
talk.
It'll be fairly casual. It'll be casual. Consider this a very private studio. We're in a private studio.
In fact, maybe we should have like curved it so that we have a conversation.
We can
with
still
each
curve
other.
it a little bit.
So we're having a conversation kind of with each other.
Like it's like we're on the talk or something.
Yeah. Well, that's an idea.
I do always have like talk show aspirations whenever we set up for stuff. I'm always like, oh, it would be like a talk show. Yeah, although you can pull the tables closer too.
Yeah,
Make sure that you have access to them.
Yeah, everything's set up. Cool. Awesome. I mean, how long do we want to stop?
Do we want to see if there's anyone who's outside? This is actually meant to be inside.
Yeah, do you want to just do a quick announcement outside, Archie? With the yellow chain thing? 12:30. It's technically 12:30. The yellow chains or whatever is out
whatever outside.
there.
Just make it
Thanks.
outside. Where the people are.
That is just starting.
Yeah.
Yeah, that we will be starting soon. Soonish.
I feel nervous that the mic is breaking. I
Well,
mean, despite
so-
my very public role, I'm
Actually, we're.
Yeah, so despite
Hello?
despite the fact that there are not a lot of people here, I would ask that we still use the mics for the video.
Yeah, for the video, absolutely.
I can't tell you I did human co-business.
No worries. Yeah.
I do have a cold. Well, people, I didn't even have a chance to announce this to my class.
Yeah, me
we
either.
were and not at all last night because we were like trying to finish everything over spring break and then just like coming like really tight.
But I love the counts.
That's
love
what
the
they
counts.
design.
That's yeah,
Everyone,
for student
everyone,
graphic
everyone is
designer.
crazy about design.
Yeah.
Design is gorgeous.
It is
If there's
gorgeous.
one thing that we do in Mosaic, it's brand is beautiful.
I would argue you do more than that, but okay.
Not much more.
So modest, too modest.
Actually, if people knew what you guys are doing behind the scenes logistically, I think they would be overwhelmed.
And we're a I appreciate that. And not everyone says that to us.
I appreciate that.
But I can tell you, one thing is that we had a faculty search, and then we took every single faculty member who came for an interview to show them all of the cultural centers. And almost everyone was like, these are fantastic, and they just appreciated the fact that we even have them on our campus. And so I actually think it's a major, I mean, not to be crass, but from a university standpoint, recruiting, it's a major potential point of
Oh, yeah.
donation.
We will in this our people.
You're absolutely right. I wish more people understood that from a, like not just a student affairs lens, but from the whole campus lens.
Right.
In the lack of this stuff.
Oh.
Yes, in fact,
Okay.
we had some people who were
Outside.
coming in from
Yeah.
very
Well, there's gonna be
non-diverse
food.
areas.
Yeah.
They were just
Yeah.
so relieved.
Yeah. Okay.
They were
Cool.
just,
I mean, we can go ahead and get started. Yeah. We can go ahead and get started. Do folks want to scoot like maybe this way a little bit so you're not just staring at a podium? I mean, you can still stay like towards the back, but you can move just a little bit that way too. Cool. Thank you. Okay. So, yeah, so we'll go ahead and get started. So we are also live streaming this on our YouTube page. So whatever we'll talk about for the panel will also be there if folks want to see it later. And I think we have some folks joining us online right now too. So cool. We're good to go, Aaron? Yep. Okay. Thank you. I assume you put your thumb up, but the booth is dark, so I can't see anything there. Okay. So thank you, folks, for coming. Welcome to San Jose State's Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month. We are very excited to be able to share with you all this wonderful month of engagement that we have prepared. As with all of our Heritage Months at San Jose State, this is an effort that is a partnership across all of campus, including the Center for Asian Pacific Islander Student Empowerment, or CAPISE, Asian American Studies in the College of Sociology, Mosaic Cross-Cultural Center, and many other folks. This year, we celebrate the theme of API and the arts. Not only is API identity enjoying a year of visibility and representation, we're also celebrating this generation of API artistic expression. In the last few years, we have seen folks of various Asian, South Asian, West Asian, and Pacific Islander identities in our movies, literature, television shows, music, online videos, video games, and more. I remember a time, as I'm sure many of our staff and faculty do, where our representation was Data in Goonies, Lon Duck Dong in 16 Candles, Rosalind Chow's character on Star Trek, imported Jackie Chan movies, and what is still one of my favorite movies, The Joy Luck Club. Our exposure to representation was either the stereotypical roles or being confronted by our own cultures as filtered through the lens of Western worlds that historicized and exotified us as art pieces in the British Museum or James Michener novels or experimental tracks on Beatles albums. Where we are now is a long way from where we were before, but it has been a long-fought journey of breaking down barriers, cracking through bamboo ceilings, and literally innovating brand new media to reach pop culture relevancy. A lot of that work originated right here in the Bay Area, and we hope to celebrate that throughout the month. But even with the journey of the last 30 years, we have a long way to go. We recognize the fact that API doesn't always evoke representation of all the people and ethnicities within the diaspora. We recognize that model minority myths continue to confine perception of API identities and limit the necessary dialogues within our diaspora. We recognize that religious oppression, imperialism, and conflict create strife both toward and within our diaspora. And one of the ways that we wanted to start that interrogation was this dialogue about our name. So this brings us to our panel. Hi, everyone. On stage here, we have the following members of our community. We have Ginny Pranan, Program Director for CAPISE. We have Sahar Nojan, faculty member in the Asian American Studies Department in the College of Sociology. We have Kayla Lee, sophomore forensic biology major and Asian American Studies minor, as well as a community organizer for CAPISE. And we have Ravisha Mathur, faculty member within the Lurie College of Education, and this year's recipient of the Distinguished Service Faculty Award. And I'm going to sit down here because then I'll be more comfortable. All right. Cool. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. To start off with, I would love for us to be able to start off with talking a little bit about the API acronym. And I'd love to start on that side with Ginny and Sahar to share maybe a little bit about the history of the use of API in our community within this country.
Hello? So she just tested it and then handed it to me. So I think that, when we were talking about this panel, one of the things that I wanted to talk about is that there's so many acronyms that we use to describe the Asian and Pacific Islander community, right? So API stands for Asian and Pacific Islander. You probably heard of AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander, APIA, Asian Pacific Islander American, AANHPI, Asian American Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander, and a bunch of others that just take those letters and kind of mix them around in order. So sometimes Pacific Islander and Asian American, so PIAA. There's a lot of these different terms, and they're all differently loaded, right? I think that that's one thing that we really wanted to kind of talk through a little bit, is that we use a lot of these different terms, and sometimes we don't know where they come from or what's the intention behind why they're being used, right? So I think one thing is to recognize is that Asian American as a term is relatively new, right? I think, and I'll leave it to Sahar to maybe speak more to that history of the newness of Asian American, but I really want to bring to this panel and bring to folks watching is that there are all of these different terms, but have you stopped to think about why you're using that term or why it's being used or how it's being used? There are a lot of nonprofit organizations, government institutions, institutions of higher education that are using different terminology, different letters, also APIDA, so Asian Pacific Islander Desi American, which we'll talk a little bit more about later too. And why are we using them? Have we asked that question? And it's not necessarily about being embarrassed to ask the question, but like do your research or, look it up or understand that and taking the time to do that rather than just like fluently saying these terms and like, I can say API, I can say, AAPI or PIAA, like get to know why we use those terms and the intentionality behind them. And I think that that's part of the history and part of the highlight that I want to bring to this. But also there is a history behind these terms and why they were kind of smushed together. So I want to maybe pass it off to Sahar to maybe start that conversation and I can add in.
All right, hi everyone. So raise your hand if you know the history of where Asian American came from. Anyone? Wow, okay. So Asian American as a term actually was first created in 1968 by two UC Berkeley students who were organizing as in a collaboration with UC Berkeley and San Francisco State as part of the Third World Liberation Strike, right? So these students were inspired by the Black Power movement. They were fighting for ethnic studies. They were inspired by the anti-war movements, right? From like the post and during Vietnam War era, and so these students, so okay, so I'm like, which part of the history should I start from? But like, so basically, right, Vietnam War in the 70s, a lot of these students were realizing that as people were coming back, as the Vietnam War was so publicized compared to any other war in American history, they were realizing that the enemy. A lot of Asian American students were realizing that the enemy looked like them, right, on TV, and that they needed to do something. There had to be some kind of allyship to, address the kind of racism that was happening on the domestic front, in addition to like the imperial racism, right, the colonial military violence that was happening abroad. And so the Third World Liberation Strike movement was an anti-imperial movement, but it was also a fight for ethnic studies, right, a fight for actually, to start, it was a fight for third world studies, right, which is actually grounding it more in its anti-colonial and anti-imperial roots, right, addressing how, we can't really talk about ethnic studies without understanding how our conditions are shaped by what the U.S. does in other countries, right, and why we come here in the first place, because of involvement in other places. And so I hope that makes sense, but the term itself, right, so Asian American came out in 1968 when students inspired by the Black Power movement wanted to form a coalition across different Asian American groups, right? Before then, there was like Japanese students, Korean students, Filipino students who didn't necessarily always get along. They weren't necessarily, like buddies on campus, right? But they needed to find some kind of umbrella term to kind of organize around so that they can also fight for representation, not only, on the more like governmental kind of fighting for rights on a anti-imperial side, but then also in higher education, right? Fighting for a curriculum that represents them and their, community's experiences and needs and so on. I think I'll leave it there.
And so you have, Asian American being coined in like grassroots organizing in the 1960s, early 70s. How does it get to be then this term that we see on the census, right? This term that we see in all these institutions of government and power. And it's co-opting, just straight up, right? So like Third World Liberation Front is an incredibly powerful movement. Obviously, we benefit from it even now, right? Having access to centers that support our communities academic departments that provide us the grounding to delve into those histories and those lived experiences. But Asian American at some point along the way gets co-opted by the government as a way to designate a specific group of people. And then that's where a lot of the stereotypes kind of snowball into what we see now around model minority, especially in its height in the 80s, right? Because tying into economic boom of a lot of countries in Asia, particularly in East Asia, then you get things around model minority myth really coming into fruition, even though those are also grounded in the 1960s, right? In these framings of pitting people of color against one another, again, to sabotage things like the Third World Liberation Front and like the Organizing for Third World Studies, ethnic studies. But they proliferate and they again get co-opted into this idea of Asian American. At some point along the way, and I'm not as familiar with this history, we then start talking about our Pacific Islander folks, and it just becomes API, right? It becomes Asian Pacific Islander, not even an and, Asian Pacific Islander. And so that is also a problem in and of itself, right? Because that's lumping in a lot of the histories of our Pacific Islander communities in with our Asian communities, right? And there are shared histories around migration, colonization, militarization, but it's really important to also take those apart. A lot of these, island nations, island cultures experienced a lot of violence during World War II and beyond in terms of militarization and occupation, and then and colonization prior to that that led to the militarization. So I think that also understanding that this smush of API together is problematic, right? And why we've seen more of a disaggregation even within our Pacific Islander community to talk about the Native Hawaiian experience, right? That it's currently under colonization by the United States, essentially, and how that differentiates to some other experiences within the Pacific Islander diaspora. So I think that that's something that we really need to kind of delve into more. I'm not even as thoroughly, knowledgeable about that history in our Pacific Islander communities, but even sharing this with you all to then so you can all learn more, I think is part of the conversation.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing. This also, I think what's interesting is that, as Ginny was saying, and we don't recognize that Asian American came out of the political organizing, right? Like you were saying, and like Chris was saying, it is a very political term, right? And so the idea of it banding people together, it came out of them organizing together, right? Like them actually working together. And so this co-option that happens, it doesn't involve organizing from the grassroots, right? And that's why it doesn't feel authentic. It doesn't feel like we always fit, because we weren't organizing together to make it happen, right? It was from a top-down kind of administrative inclusion. And then the other thing I wanted to mention, which I'm just going to table for now, but yeah.
Oh, okay, cool. Thank you so much for sharing that info. I think a big part of wanting to do this program is being able to pass this information on, right? So thank you so much. So talking about, communities, I'd love to shift a little bit to our own individual experiences of communities, right? So maybe starting with Ravisha here. What does API mean for you, your identities? How do you relate to it?
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Chris. Can you hear me? Okay. For me personally, the mic. Okay. So I grew up in the 70s, right when the term was being formed. And so the term Asian American doesn't feel authentic to who I am and to my own identity. I've always viewed myself as Indian. And that was how other people identified me as I was going through my early elementary school years. And that's how my whole family talked about our own family identities and our own ethnic identities. and then secondary to that being American as well. And so the term API doesn't have the same meaning or history to me that it does for the current generations, or for even for my own son, who sees that as a term that applies to him. And so it's a very strange thing to kind of be lumped to this category of Asian American or API, because I feel like it just kind of homogenizes the whole group, and it doesn't necessarily reflect our individual identities. I understand the reasoning for why it's there. I understand the history and the need in terms of organizing. And when you organize, you get more power. But I also have seen that it's been co-opted and it's been used in ways that have been very stereotyping, and in ways to kind of diminish our individual groups within that very large classification or category. I do think that there is a lot of power for being Asian in the United States. I think we don't utilize our power enough. I wish we were organized even more. But I do feel like it's part of the problem is this identity issue and how we identify ourselves. And so when people ask, what is your identity? I don't say API. I don't say Asian American. I always just say I'm Indian. And that's who I am.
Yeah, I would just like to share that my perspective is a little bit different. I think growing up in a heavily API community, and also growing up in the early 2000s to like 2010s, I would say that API is similar to my experience simply because I felt in community a lot when I was living with such a large API community. But at the same time, I think recognizing that I'm also Vietnamese American, so I kind of had both ends of kind of what you were saying, Ravisha. I think it's, as I've kind of learned through like a lot of Asian American studies and other classes of that sort, it's like this idea that API and Asian American specifically was born out of shared oppression and the want for shared liberation. And so it's kind of like a factor that like allows people to be in solidarity, but that shouldn't be like a limiting, defining factor of like a lot of API folks, which is why I would say I am Asian American, but I'm also like Vietnamese American. I'm born to like to first generation immigrants. And so I think there's more complexity than just being only Asian American in that sense.
I'm just going to add in because I really appreciate that thought, Kayla, because I grew up in a community where I grew up in a community where there was no Asian community. I grew up in a mainly white community in the early 70s. Even our Indian community wasn't very organized. I grew up in the East Coast in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It wasn't very organized. Our temple and our religious organizations were kind of like a house that we all went to, so it wasn't very organized when I was growing up, and it became more organized over time. And so it does depend on the community that you're living in, and I think that also kind of speaks to why the term Asian American is used in certain communities, and where our individual identity communities are used in other communities based on the region that you live on.
Right. So it's interesting because I guess, can I ask you, Kayla, put you on the spot? When people ask you, hey, like, where are you from? Or, what are you? What's your first response?
I feel like my first response would be Vietnamese American. I think just being in the API community and having a large group there, I think they already kind of noticed that you're Asian or API. Mm-hmm. And so I would say I'm Vietnamese just to kind of specify. Mm-hmm. But honestly, it really depends on the circumstance I'm in and with the people I'm around. Yeah. If I notice that like it's a group of API folks, then I'm like assuming that they know and that they can kind of recognize that. Yeah. And so I would specify. But once again, I've also had experience where like people don't even know what Vietnam is, even though like there was the Vietnam War, it was heavily publicized, but like people are like, where is that? I don't even know where that is on the globe. And it's just like, there's a lot of times in which I sort of assume that people don't have the context, and so I'll switch between the two.
Interesting. Yeah, I was asking because, go ahead.
I was going to say that when people ask me that question, like if they say, where are you from? Yeah. Who are you? I say, I'm from Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
Right?
Like, I'm from
because I
Fremont,
find-
California.
Yeah, I actually don't. I don't go to my ethnic identity
Yeah.
because I feel like it's a way of othering people, and saying that somehow you're less than or you're not as American.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And so I try to kind of confront people when they ask that question in a way by saying, I'm from Pittsburgh. And they're like, no, where are you from?
Yeah.
And then I say, I'm really from Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
And so then they kind of are like, they get flustered. And it really, I think, helps people to kind of confront some of the issues that they might have with othering people.
No, absolutely.
With that question.
And this is actually very unique to the Asian American community, right? This forever foreigner myth, right? Or stereotype that no matter how many generations your family has been in the United States, they will still consider you to be a foreigner. They will still look at you as if you don't speak English, right? Like so many of my students, like they'll have to reflect and how many times have people come up to you and assume that you didn't speak English, right? Just because of how you look, right? And it's a stereotype, right? Happens to scholars, happens to everybody, right? And what was the question again, Chris?
It was about the ideas of community and what API evokes for you and your identities.
Yeah, so it's interesting because when people ask, so Asian American, right? It's a very, so I particularly identify as Afghan, from, my parents are from Afghanistan. And so it's interesting because Afghanistan is in Central Asia. It's in the heart of Asia, it's right in the middle. But for some reason, not for some reason, for very imperial geopolitical reasons, yeah, it is really defined, every region around it is defined, right? There's South Asia, India, Pakistan, right, and the neighboring countries. Then there's East Asia, right, China, and and then there above it's like Russia and like the Soviet bloc, right? And then there's West Iran and West Asia, right, or what they would call the Middle East. And so some people would mark Afghanistan because of the way that Afghans have been racialized under the War on Terror as part of the Middle East. But what happens is that the Middle East is a very colonial term, right? It was created by Europe to literally connote the middle area between the East and Europe, right? Which was East Asia and Europe. And so, and it oftentimes gets conflated by just being of Arab descent, right? People from the Arab region who speak Arabi or, have a very different, also may share religious kind of affiliations, but have different linguistic and kind of cultural backgrounds. And so personally, I do feel as Afghans, we are Asian, but what that means in the American context is very different, right? Like across the world, you'll ask, where is Afghanistan? There'll be Southwest Asia, period. And in fact, if you look at the old Library of Congress maps from the United States, it actually will situate Afghanistan and the Middle East as part of labeling it as Southwest Asia. But then in 1978, something very interesting happens where the United States starts to shift labeling that area and region as the Middle East, right? There was that Iran-Contra affair, right? There was, Gulf Wars, things that signal that the United States wanted to designate that area as a political interest to potentially get involved in, right? And I mean like imperial involvement, not just any kind of involvement. But just wanted to make it clear. But interestingly enough, that became designated as the Middle East, right? And sorry, this is a long story, but at the same time, Middle East then became conflated with whiteness, right? And so something really interesting happens where then Afghanistan and other countries in the Arab world in West Asia become marked as white rather than Asian, which is has its own kind of bubble, and we could talk about that later.
Yeah, I appreciate the maps conversation because that is a real thing. If you're interested, go into your local library, your school library, look at the maps, go and look at historical maps, look at maps of the United States or parts of Asia, and go back to the 1800s. It's fascinating. And it tells you a lot about naming, and which we're here to talk about, right? And the way that names come from power. Whoever has power is naming. So we've kind of been alluding to it in a lot of different ways. But this idea that, the Third World Liberation Front had power, and in order to take that power and co-opt that power, the governments of power took these names and reestablished them in certain ways and gave them different things and gave them and infused them with different types of meanings, right? So thinking about names have power. The words that we use, the letters that we use to describe ourselves have power, right? And individual power as well as institutionalized power and systematic power. So I think that that's been coming up as I was just listening to you all, especially the maps conversation, because I did that too when I was in grad school. I did maps of South Asia, which is very interesting too. But for me, around API, actually very similar connections to both Kayla and Ravisha, what you shared. I grew up in the Bay Area in Santa Clara in the 80s and 90s, where there was an Asian community. As my mother said when she moved here and immigrated here, she was like, there were so many people who looked like me doing everything, and it was so nice because she went to school in Colorado, which was Ravisha's experience. But it wasn't a big community, and I identify as Nepali American. My parents immigrated to the United States from Nepal in the late 70s, early 80s. So there wasn't a lot of folks who ethnically identified with my community, and my parents were actually probably one of the couple of families who established themselves early on in the Bay Area too. And now there's a huge community here actually. And so I grew up watching the community grow, watching the South Asian community grow in this area. There wasn't a lot of South Asians. There was one other Indian person I went to middle school and high school with. And we're both what the heck? Because we were the brown kids. And so being able to see that trajectory and having that experience of not identifying as Asian, not being able to identify as Asian because I wasn't seen as Asian because no one else really knew. There were more Southeast Asian folks and more East Asian folks, so connected to your story, Ravisha, in that way. But at the same time, I found a lot of power because I wasn't able to be identified as Asian, or even people recognize where Nepal was, right? Do you know where Mount Everest is? Do you know the tallest mountain in the world? Yeah, that's Mount Everest. Yeah, that's where I'm from. Not really, but whatever. And, having gone through that for the majority of my childhood, even to college, and then found a lot of solidarity with organizing with folks around Asian American API folks. That's where I found a lot of the solidarity and community that I had been looking for around my ethnic identity, and being recognized around that, and also advocating for my community as South Asian, as Nepali. So I think that's where a lot of the where I also go back between the two, like Kayla as well, because of my experiences.
Great. Thank you, everybody, so much for sharing. Really appreciate hearing all of your experiences, and it makes me happy to hear that you all have gone through these experiences, and it has provided strength and enrichment, even though there was also hardship and challenges along the way. And I think it strengthens the community, right, to have different perspectives and not have just a singular perspective. Formerly at San Jose State, we have used the acronym APIDA, or Asian Pacific Islander Desi American, to label this diaspora, the work that we do, the Heritage Month, and we're not now, right? So I wanted to spend some time talking about this label and what it may or may not evoke, right? So I'd love to open the floor to anybody who would like to talk about the inclusion or exclusion of the Desi label in the acronym.
I think everyone's looking to me. So I'll start, but I know that there are other people on the panel who have experiences and opinions on this. I think this also roots in my own experience too. I'll say this to an extent, but I'll start from the institutional perspective and having had this conversation. I remember, so I served as a Middle Eastern and South Asian Student Affairs officer at one of my positions prior to this institute, prior to being the director of CAPISE at San Jose State. And during our API Heritage Month at that institution, we ended up holding a roundtable with South Asian students. And we ended up in this really fascinating conversation about Desi in particular, and Desi and its nuances and challenges. And so, remembering some of the students in the room, and this is a while ago, but we had some students who were Punjabi, some students who were Sri Lankan, were Bangladeshi, myself as a Nepali person, some Indian, maybe one or two Indian folks. And so we were talking about this term, and almost everyone around the table said they didn't identify as Desi. The Punjabi experience around partition and the complexity of that. If you're not aware of partition, please look it up. 1947, India, Pakistan, the creation of India and Pakistan as we currently know it. That Punjab as a state and as a community of people was divided. And so there's a lot of tension around that, right? And so those folks coming in with that conversation, the Sri Lankan folks and the Bangladeshi folks coming in with similar kind of connections to me, in that Desi is not a term that's from our language or in our culture. It didn't relate to us. Desi is a term that is that means like of the people of the country, of the land, and but it's very Hindi specific, the language Hindi. And so, I was more exposed to Nepali, and I'm also ethnically Newari, which is an ethnic community native to the Kathmandu Valley. Our language is not Sanskrit based, and so there's also that piece around like not connecting to that term, and that term also having negative connotations within the within Nepal itself. So I didn't grow up hearing that term as a positive, even from my parents, and so. In this roundtable, we all had these different experiences, and there were some conversations about like thinking about our refugee folks, like thinking about Bhutanese refugees and things of that nature. And Desi being a term for South Asia was very resisted in that conversation. And I carried that conversation with me because it was the first time I had a conversation where I was like, a bunch of South Asian people got in the room, all of us had different experiences, and we all agreed on this thing. And it was a really interesting experience to have, and I remember these, and I'm able to kind of share some of these nuances because I think I kept those stories with me as I moved forward and thinking about like, what does Desi not represent, right? Where are we missing it? And so you've probably heard of Desi as a term that's often conflated with South Asia, with South Asians, to describe all the folks from South Asia. And I just communicated to you that there was a group of people around a table who definitely did not identify as Desi from their personal experiences, from their lived experiences, from their cultural experiences, right? And so that is something that I've carried with me in this work, particularly, and really done a lot of kind of had conversations with folks around that. But I think also there's a lot of people that have been using PETA without knowing what that D was. And so I've encountered that too, where people come up to me and they're like, oh, can you tell me about a PETA? And I'm like, okay, let's have this conversation, and this is what Desi is. That's the D. This is what it's meant to represent, and then this is some of the complex nuances around whether everyone feels represented by that D, right? And I think one other thing that I'll note before I pass it on to some other folks is that the inclusion of Desi was originally to bring about and to challenge this issue that we kind of were alluding to earlier, where Asian in API, but Asian particularly in API, was seen as East Asian and Southeast Asian, but really East Asian primarily, right? So the idea was to bring in Desi as a way to show that South Asia or Desi folks are included as a part of Asia. But as I just shared, there's a lot of complexity into that. So I'll pass it on to other folks to share. Anyone?
So I agree with everything that Jenny said, and I'm just going to talk about my personal and my lived experience with the word Desi. I think Desi is a way that people have utilized to refer to the South Asian populations, because they have been, sometimes when people think about Asia, they don't think about South Asia. And so Desi was a way to kind of be more inclusive in some sense, to include South Asians in that conversation, in the organizing, and as a way to kind of say, to be more inclusive. But Desi refers to people who are from India, from Bangladesh, from Pakistan, and even within those countries, those are very multi-ethnic countries. And so I feel like Desi has been used in a way to be more inclusive, but in some ways to homogenize the cultural identities, the traditions, the language, the values, in many, many ways and in many, many spaces. From a personal lived experience, Desi has always had a very negative connotation for myself. It's been used as part of another phrase known as ABCD, American-born confused Desi, individuals who are very confused about their identity, and it's been used when I was growing up as a way to kind of, as a derogatory term, just saying like, oh, you're just Desi, meaning that you're less than me or my cultural group or my identity. And so I've always had a very negative connotation to it. And I've always resisted using that term and even labeling myself as part of that group for a variety of reasons. The reasons that I just mentioned in terms of my personal life and the experiences of people hurling that to me as an insult. And as another thing is that it homogenizes these very rich populations of people who are very different from one another and deserve to be labeled with their own identity in their own terms. I do see the value in terms of organizing and being more inclusive, but I think that there are other ways to do it. In preparation for this conversation, when we were just talking about naming, I took opportunities to kind of talk to my father, who's in his 80s, and then to my nephew, who's in his 20s, or he just turned 21. And I said, what do you think about this term Desi? They had the opposite reactions. My father was like, that term is a very negative term. We should not use this to refer to ourselves. It's a way to kind of make us feel less than other individuals who are American. And we're not confused about our identity. So he and I are, maybe we're not in the same generation, but we had the same experiences with that term. My nephew's like, oh, that term is wonderful. It refers to all of these South Asian groups, and it's a way to get us organized and together and on the same page. So I do think that there's a generational issue in terms of the use of the word, but we do need to be mindful of the history of that word, particularly here in the United States, because it can have very emotional aspects to that word. And so when I heard about the APITA task force when I came to San Jose State, I was like, why are we using this term? And it was an opportunity to kind of have some great conversations about it. But for me, and it always will be, I don't think I can change this aspect of myself. It'll always be a very negative word and a way to kind of say you're less than.
To add something. So I think it was a sociologist did a study, Jennifer Lee, if you want to look it up, in, I believe, 2020 or 20, I think the survey was sent out in 2018, and it was sent out to the general public, like American public. And what she was doing was she was asking people who counts as Asian, right, in short terms, basically. And across the board, right, so people of different races, white, black, Latinx, and then different people for the Asian diaspora. What y'all were saying, right, overwhelmingly more than 70%, 80% East Asian, right, or definitely considered to be Asian. Filipinos were like 73%. Everyone else, Japanese, Chinese, were like 80% and above. And then when it came to South Asians, the subtitle of their paper was the South Asian exclusion. And it was because only about like 40-something%, 43 or 48, can't remember, only 43% of Americans believe that South Asians could be counted as Asians. That's like very small, right? And so it just also kind of tells you, and then I'll add also 30% of Americans believe that Arabs could be counted as Asian. And so I also wanted to just, something that my colleague in Asian American Studies, Dr. Joanne Rendelia, one time we were having this conversation, and she was saying, why does everyone want to fit into a box, right? Like, why do we have to force ourselves into a box? Why should, rather than thinking about what's the purpose of this box, right? Like, why do we even want to be in it? And so it also kind of, this conversation makes me think about, right, what y'all are talking about. Like, there's so much diversity in all of the different countries in South Asia, right? That what's the point of being within that larger aggregate when we're all the time trying to disaggregate it anyways, right? So I don't have an answer. I just wanted to pose more questions.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because I think that that's one of the things that comes up for me, is that like, why are we like creating smaller and smaller boxes, right? For disaggregation purposes and for slightly aggregating to like be able to do, you know, in my work, being able to provide services appropriate to the needs of different communities, like that makes sense a little bit. But I don't think I like go to each person and be like, you're South Asian, therefore X, Y, and Z, right? You're Desi, and therefore X, Y, and Z. And I think that that's one of the things that comes up for me too, on an individual level. And like, I think what we've been kind of talking about is like, every person has an intimate experience with a term, right? And so it's best to just check in with folks around like, hey, like, is this work for you? Is this where you're at with this term, or how you refer to yourself, right? I think that's just in general across the board, not just ethnic identity, gender identity, etc., right? Just checking in with folks, asking what the needs are on that point. But I think to connect back to kind of the institutional piece, so Ravisha brought up, like, when she came to San Jose State, we had the APITA task force. Why are we using the same? I similarly, when I applied to my job, my position in the center was called the APITA Student Success Center. And I was like, why are we using APITA here? So, you know, I go in fully knowing that and understanding that, and go through the interview process. And then, you know, I get to campus and I want to learn, right? And that's the first step to understanding a term and its use in a place, is that getting to know the people on where the term is being used, right? Getting to know the culture there. So as I was talking to folks, and some of the folks watching some of those students might be watching, you know, I started like hanging out in the centers, hanging out in Mosaic Cross-Cultural Center, and like, you know, getting to know people, letting them know about myself. This was before we had our center in Capice. And it came up naturally from one student, and I know they know who they are. And they were like, hey, so why do we use APITA? You know, the Desi feels like it's not inclusive of like our Afghan folks and other folks. And I was like, oh, so I didn't have to bring up this conversation myself, which was beautiful, because I think that there was an interest in having the conversation before I got here. And that was helpful for me. And so as, I met folks who were interested in having that conversation, students, as well as staff and faculty who were like, I don't understand APITA. Can you kind of talk to me about what this is? And I would, as I mentioned earlier, I would talk about what the term, how it breaks down, and then also share a little bit about Desi in particular. I think more folks started to understand that maybe we shouldn't be using this. And maybe that there was a way to be, maybe a little bit more homogenizing at the API level, but allowed for people to bring who they were to the term, right? And I think that this panel also brings that in as well. And so I think that's why we leaned in that direction. And I'll name one other thing, is that why we took off the American is a very specific, so APITA, API, D, Desi, A, American, is because we have a large international student population on this campus, particularly from Asian countries. And actually a majority of our international students identify from Asian countries or Asian cultures. And so the inclusivity was intentional there as well, to be inclusive of our Asian international students who may not necessarily feel connected to the American part of that term, but still are connected, want to be connected culturally, would like resources, and want a space that still understands parts of their culture, even if it is a different framing of their culture, right? Like being from Nepal is different than me growing up as a Nepali American. I know that. I've definitely experienced that in my life, right? So when I approach a Nepali student, like, we can connect because they know that I understand certain aspects of their experience, but there's certain experiences I won't understand as well. But because we don't have the American on the end, it allows for that fluidity for both, Asian American students to connect as well as Asian international students connect, right? So thinking about, like, how do we expand things to allow for more than to narrow down into boxes, which actually confines and allows for less.
Thank you, everybody. Yeah, I distinctly remember when we were on the task force, Ravisha and we would have meetings, right? And we were right at the cusp of where we are now, right? And I remember very diplomatically, right? Ravisha would be like, APITA Center. Are we calling it the APITA Center? And we were like, no, we'll hire Ginny first, and then we'll figure it out. Yeah, so I remember those moments. So as you all have discussed, right, and brought up, API is, dominated. They're oftentimes in our culture dominated by East Asian hegemony, right? Chinese, Japanese, Korean identities are often on the forefront of API representation when we talk about it, particularly in this country, right? So the diaspora itself, however, is like the most expansive diaspora, right, as it pertains to ethnicities, right? So what are we missing when we talk about API? What are the things that, folks, you would like to communicate to folks about, API identities, right? As we, have the opportunity, perhaps talking to people watching live stream, that aren't having the face-to-face conversation with us. Like, what are the messages we want to broadcast about? What are we missing within the API diaspora?
Well, I know what I think is missing, and I think many times in our academic training or in our professional lives, we are not encouraged to kind of think about our cultural or ethnic or national, our identities in general. And from my perspective, I find that being Indian is actually a strength and an asset. And I think what we need to do as an API community is to kind of think about what are our strengths and assets and our individual identities and how we can bring that to the table in terms of our leadership, our organization, our learning about ourselves. I mean, I'm not sitting up here as an expert, an API expert. I'm sitting up here as a person who's still learning about myself and other identities in the API communities. And so, but I really think that we need to bring our API identities to the table and to the forefront instead of trying to say, well, yeah, that's part of me. That's who I am. It is like, I am Indian, and here's why I'm a leader. And it's part of our strengths and it's part of our assets. And I think we need to really help our students see that their identities are an asset to who they are and actually can make them a stronger professional in whatever communities they choose to join. So I wish that conversation happened a lot more. We're really sometimes, especially in the world of academics, we're not encouraged to think about our identities in our work. And I think that that is a critical piece of how we do our research, how we do our teaching, how we do our service. We really need to think about utilizing our identities to the forefront and bring it to the forefront.
So I'm going to disagree just a little bit. I feel like as a sociologist, we're always talking about identity, right? And then also as trained as a critical race and ethnic studies scholar, it's very much at the forefront of our studies and the way that we do research and at least the way that, positionality is so important, the community engaged research that, I've been trained in. And so, but having said that, I think sometimes we obsess too much about identity. Personally, I feel like, and yes, I'm a critical race and ethnic studies scholar. I teach Asian American studies, right? But at the same time, when working with like student success, I've done research on student success and I've done research on kind of different needs on higher education campuses related to structural racism. And what I find is, oftentimes these institutions, just like the way that they siloed ethnic studies, is that they silo these services for the students, right? And that's not beneficial for any of them, right? The Black students face, the same kind of needs as the Asian students, as the Latinx students. Yes, there are important differences, right? There are extremely important differences based on the historical legacies of each community, right? And the trauma and the violence that they've experienced. But there's also similarities, right? There's also things that they could all share in terms of services. And so one of the kind of findings that come out of my research sometimes is that what if we had intersectional services? Like, what if we had centers based on the actual needs of students, like based on, human needs, student needs, rather than like focusing on the identity-based needs, right? Because like, what would that, and this is an idea, right? Like, what would it be different? What kind of, collaboration and solidarity would we see in our centers, right? Across different student groups. Yeah, so that's something that I've been thinking about, right, is this idea of how institutions love to silo us according to our identities and what's missing there, right, like that solidarity piece that could happen and how it may be hindered. And then, of course, there's the whole conversation about, which I mentioned earlier, but, you know, Afghans having a place in Asia, and what does that mean, right? A lot of the times applying for funding, I was talking to an Afghan American community organizer, and she was saying that she was trying to apply for funding for her nonprofit under the Asian American Foundation. And they were like, well, Afghanistan, that doesn't count as Asia. Like, what are you talking about? And then she was like, okay. But then a lot of times Middle Eastern people don't see Afghanistan as being part of the Middle East either, right? So it's like, okay, so what do we do, right? And so it does become an issue where, yes, I totally agree, like, we shouldn't fit ourselves into these boxes, but when it comes down to resources and funding, these are important markers, right? Like right now, the U.S. Census is deciding between whether or not to include the Middle Eastern North African category on the census, and there's this huge debate across, you know, the different diasporas in Southwest Asia and the neighboring, Central Asia as to, do we fit? Do we want this? Should we identify in this way? And like, what are the drawbacks and benefits? So, yeah.
Yeah, kind of adding on to kind of what you were saying, Dr. Nojan, I think there is a real need to disaggregate sort of data, you know, like the way in which, like the question poses the East Asian hegemony when we, put solely one group at the forefront, especially one that has been seen as the model minority, when there's so many different issues that like are disproportionately affecting different like specific ethnic groups within like the API community. It's kind of like just saying you're Asian, you're in the model minority, you don't need resources, which is a real issue, especially when you consider the different circumstances that brought a lot of API folks here. Like for some folks, it was like economic opportunities, but then there was also, for a lot of communities that are refugee communities coming from war, especially in like Southeast, Central, West Asia, it's ignoring the resources that are needed for like mental health and for recognizing, like economic subsidies and like financial welfare and things like that. So when we like basically put all of us in this like broad category and kind of base it off of one single community's experience, then it's just like kind of an excuse for like the government and like people who provide these resources to say you don't need them.
Yeah, so I think I love this conversation because I think that I agree exactly with what Kayla and Sahar has mentioned, and yet I said, why don't we just make it broader? Which seems really counterintuitive, but it actually isn't, because you don't have to be inclusive through boxes. You can practice inclusive. You can be inclusive in your practices with broad strokes while also still holding and thinking about the individual experiences within, right? So I say API, but it's not to say that I'm not thinking about the different experiences of Southeast Asian folks, specifically, folks impacted by the Vietnam War, and then our South Asian folks and our East Asian folks, right? Those are different experiences, and even in generationally, we have, fourth generation Chinese American folks versus, our first generation, Chinese immigrants. Those are different experiences, and I keep that in my knowledge base, right? It's not necessarily like, okay, API, it looks like this, broad strokes. On top of that, and I think the one thing, the original question, what are we missing? And Chris is smiling at me because he knows what I'm going to say, I feel like. But when we talk about API, we don't talk about Pacific Islander folks enough in this conversation. And I think that's one thing that I always will say, especially when I don't feel like it's heard enough. I think from my own experience, this comes from my own experience and why I say that, because I experienced so much marginalization within the API umbrella growing up and even now, and not being seen, not being heard. And so I look out for my community members who I know are also experiencing similar things. And I feel like in conversations that I've had, in the privilege that I've had to work with other Pacific Islander folks, the solidarity I have in that conversation is very much there. Because I think that, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, like PI, Pacific Islanders, just kind of got lumped into this conversation. And we haven't thought about the experiences enough or had conversations enough about the experience of our Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander folks specifically. Again, saying NHPI too, because again, that difference there too, in like how their diaspora has experienced militarization, colonization, imperialism, and also what's that impact look like on, you know, Pacific Islander American communities, those who have, you know, migrated over to the United States, and also their experiences of higher education, of institutional experiences, right? And that there are similarities in terms of the needs, but the historical impacts are different, right? What have caused that, right? So I think for me, when we talk about what are we missing, for me, it's like the conversation around our Pacific Islander folks. And for Asian folks to be more aware that it's not just API, that's me, but it's Asian and Pacific Islander folks who I'm in solidarity with and I'm in community with, and that how can I also be in support of them as much as they are in support of us? And also, how can I understand our shared roots and our shared experiences? Because there is so much shared history and migration if you start to understand the Pacific Islander experience with the Asian experience.
Yeah, just on that last note, right? I think it's really important. So just this past class, we were talking about Guam, right? And how it was Guam and the Philippines, major stopping points for the large-scale Vietnamese, you know, rescue mission, right? Of taking refugees, settling them in Guam in refugee camps or in the Philippines, and then processing them before they came to the United States. And that impact that it had on Guam, right? So just like numbers-wise, because I just did this lesson yesterday, but 13,000 was the amount of refugees that Guam said it could take in, right? And remember that Guam was a U.S. colonial territory, right? So they said 13,000, right? And the U.S. at its peak had settled 115,000 Vietnamese refugees in Anderson Camp in Guam. And the impact that had on the native, right, Chamorro people and the people from Guam, like, that was, you know what I'm saying, like, that's violence, right? That's, you know, trauma that, yes, not the Vietnamese people themselves, you know, intended to create, but was a result of U.S., you know, creating the conditions that then caused, you know, antagonism and violence, right? And so just also kind of noting, yes, those shared histories and how a lot of communities, right, it's always about, like, and that's what the Third World Liberation Strike, right, is making us look at where, you know, look back at the powers, right, looking back at those who control and who, you know, perpetuate the violence, and kind of helping us have that shared lens so that we don't, because sometimes I think it's important to understand that there have been antagonism, like intra-community antagonisms within the Asian American Pacific Islander category, right, that oftentimes we don't talk about. But then recognizing those, that also sometimes those are at play because of the ways, you know, intentionally the U.S. and, you know, and for example, I'll give another example where in Hawaii, right, where Japanese migrants were working on sugar plantations, right, how the plantation owners would bring in Korean migrants on purpose to break the strikes of the Japanese Americans, right? Building antagonism within the Asian American community. And so it's not, So always recognizing, right, that capitalism, right, and all of these kind of forces at play really do drive some of the more nuances and hate that comes out of these conversations.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing, everybody. So I just want to wrap up with revisitation of our theme, right? So the theme of our month, as I mentioned, is API in the arts, right? So we're celebrating the representation and exploration of API identities within media, music, literature, photography, all sorts of artistic endeavors. So I wanted to invite the panel to share some thoughts about what art means to them. Have you seen yourself represented in art, and where do you think we still need to go?
I don't think she meant to do that. I think you just meant to hand me the mic, but I feel like it's like, speak. No, it's all good. This is a very like near and dear question to my heart because I was just talking to Chris about this morning. I was raised by television. I talk about this. Actually, a lot of my research, I don't talk about this. So I have my PhD in cultural studies. Not that it's hidden or anything. I just don't talk about it. I have my PhD in cultural studies, and my research area is media audiences and identity formation because I grew up on television. Part of it is that like I feel like I learned how to be American from TV, and I say this because I didn't see a lot of myself in TV, right? I was constantly looking for the person of color on TV, like loved so much Black television in the 1990s because that's where I was seeing, like, I could see someone who didn't look quite like me, but also didn't look like white folks on TV that I constantly was seeing, right? And then obviously we started to see more Asian American folks, but I also gravitated towards like anime because it was at least something else that was like, again, not American that I felt like I could connect to because I was perpetually the foreigner, right? So there are all these interesting ways in which I, interpreted my own identity through the lack of representation, right? And the ways in which I sought out representation, even in these like tangential ways. And so in that way, like and I used to teach, Asian American like cultural studies and media studies when I was still, in grad school. So like these were the conversations I was constantly getting into with students is like, where do you see yourself? How do you see yourself? Like, what is the tension around that? And, I feel like now there's a lot of great representation, way more than when I was growing up 20, 30 years ago. But at the same time, there's so much more that we can have, right? And I think that's a conversation for all communities of color, I think, in terms of just like a growth and development of that. But for me, it was so impactful to not have it, but also at least be able to connect with something that offered me a different way of understanding my experience, which then I did a lot of research on to like figure out, how a lot of folks say that grad school and like doing your PhD is I research and stuff like, or me search. I don't know if it was quite me search, but so I think that just to go like be tangential, going off on a tangent around this, I think that a lot of like media representation now is so much more nuanced than we had when I was growing up, and I think in that way that's exciting. I'm so excited for Netflix's new show Beef coming out because that's going to be incredibly nuanced in terms of talking about the Asian American experience specifically. There's so much coming out, and there's such an hunger for it, but there's also finally the energy around it to create it or give space to it. And so that's a really exciting thing to see, having grown up without all of that.
I guess I've had the same experience as Jenny, which is that most of the art around me did not reflect anything that was part of my own family experience. All of the television shows that I watched when I was a kid had no people that were brown. And so I never saw myself as part of that artistic endeavor, or I never saw myself represented. And then in the 80s, some things creeped in, and in the 90s for sure, but it all was a representation of stereotypes of Asian and very reductive in terms of our experience. And I do see some more nuance nowadays, but I still think it hasn't gone far enough. It doesn't really reflect the experiences of myself or people that I know in my own communities. And so I still haven't found anything yet in the media that is representative of how I feel about my own experience or the experiences of my childhood or even in my adulthood in terms of the nuances of what it's like to kind of navigate the world as a brown person. Maybe I did look at the trailer of Beef, and it looks like, oh my gosh, that's going to be very good. But I do think there are other forms of media. My parents did a very good job of bringing in other kinds of artistic fields. My mother painted and she did silk screening, and that's how we were exposed to some Indian art, and recognizing that Impressionism didn't only occur in Europe, it occurred in other parts of the world as well, and my parents did a really good job in terms of bringing those in. My parents, despite the fact that we grew up in Pennsylvania, we did early on recognize that there was such a thing as Bollywood, and that there was some representation of Indian life in those kinds of movies. And it was we would go into a theater that looks just like this when I was very young, and it was filled with other Indian people, and we were watching like films that came out in the 70s, and it was an experience. And so I think my parents did a good job doing that and seeking those opportunities, and as well as exposing us to Indian literature, Indian writing, Indian poetry. And so, but it was really on the onus of my parents. It wasn't something that was in our community. When we would go on field trips to the museums, there was really no representation of my heritage background. And so I feel like we've made progress, but we still have a lot of growth and opportunity in the arts. And I'm very heartened by seeing Indian artists these days and how they express themselves and how they express their heritage, or they don't express their heritage in their artwork. There's a freedom there where they don't have to kind of represent everything that they have in their identity.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that even growing up in the early 2000s, I think representation was very minimal, was very like stereotypical, borderline, just like kung fu movies. You should be represented by this, even though I did not remotely feel represented by it. I never did martial arts in my life. But I think that now I agree with what both of y'all were saying, that like there is more, but I still don't think it's enough. I think a lot of the times there's not sort of like nuanced conversations about like relationships and things like that within the API community. A lot of the times, like even when I think of recent API films like Crazy Rich Asians or things like that, it's like we are Asian and rich, and that is it. There's no depth to these characters. There's nothing really there that can show like the multifacetedness of being an API person, or just a person that happens to be API, you know, and not having API be like the sole defining factor of who you are as a character. I think some of the ways in which I found representation in like arts and media growing up was actually through America's Best Dance Crew, which was like a very popular show in the early 2000s. I'm a dancer, so watching like Quest Crew or Poriotics, who's like from the Bay Area, is they were like huge inspirations to me, even though like they didn't necessarily like state like their ethnicity, their race. Just seeing faces that looked like mine was really, really empowering as a young dancer as well. And also now hearing more stories from various API artists about like their experiences with their family, unpacking trauma, talking about mental health and things like that has been really inspiring for me. So people like Ocean Vuong, who's a poet and an author, and plenty of other authors that we also have like in our API library at Kapise are a lot of different people that I look towards.
Yeah, so I don't have to tell you that the representation of Muslims in media isn't great. And let me tell you that it did start pre 9/11, right? There's a lot of anti-Iranian and anti-Arab sentiment in the United States. So yeah, and then before that, right, you can even think about like European colonialism and how they perceived North Africans and associated them with anti-blackness, right, and things of that nature. But I will say that, it did take me, I was in a sociology class in college where I was like, oh my God, all my favorite shows have white people. And I was like, where are all the brown people? And so it did, yeah. I find that, I find affiliation with different, I guess, communities, because my community is not represented in media as much. But I will say I was once at a coffee shop, and I met this person who was sitting at the table next to me, and she was reflecting. She was a Filipina, and she was like, you know, isn't it great that we can just sit here and just reflect about, you know, like all the things that our communities have gone through, you know, when our ancestors probably didn't have the opportunity to do this, right? Like we have this opportunity. And I was like, well, actually, I'm pretty sure my ancestors did this too, you know? Like and so it's like, I get what you're saying and I appreciate the moment, but also, like, let's not forget that we have cultures, like, right? Just because the U.S. doesn't represent it or the U.S. media doesn't represent it doesn't mean that we're not communities who have this long historical, cultural, like, beautiful past, right? Or present too, right? And it reminds me of how, like, as an Afghan person, sometimes I get a little annoyed when people will send me Rumi quotes. Y'all know Rumi? You know, or should I say Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, who's, you know, an Afghan poet and Islamic scholar, and, you know, very renowned in our community. And I'll be like, oh, you know Rumi too? Okay. And so my parents, right, my grandparents, they that was their way of art, right? They would share poetry. They would, like, just, like, sometimes, like, when they couldn't find the words to express themselves, they would drop a poem, right? And it was beautiful. And so, you know, I was very lucky to grow up, you know, in my, you know, close-knit family and be able to experience, you know, art and creativity from my grandparents as well, even when, you know, society might not provide that.
I think there's one, sorry. I think there's one thing that I wanted to add in that, because again, this came from, like, the conversation we had this morning, Chris. I was telling Chris about my first experience, and it's also why the British Museum got mentioned in the opening. My first experience, I had, like, the privilege to go to Europe on a tour in high school, like, for, like, a week or two. And I went to the British Museum one day at the British Museum. Never been, and I'd never, like, seen any, like, Asian culture in a museum before. And I found the part where they had a bunch of Nepal, like, stuff from Nepal. There were, like, artifacts and beautiful, like, you know, statues. And I was like, wow, like, I feel represented. At the time, at 16, I was like, I feel represented by this. Like, I see my culture. And obviously, I was 16 and I didn't know better. And then reflecting on that years later, like, mostly, like, later in college and grad school, I was, like, horrified because I felt seen in the British Museum, but I didn't understand how that culture had been stolen, right? And so there's, like, a lot of discussion. If you follow anything about museum studies or art history, a lot of it talks about repatriation of these things that have actually been stolen during colonization, right? And so, like, I think that's also something I want to share in terms of, like, and it really connects to what you said, Sahara, around, like, we've had culture for centuries, and it's been held from us oftentimes in the American context because we haven't been exposed to it. And then I go to the British Museum and I think I found it, and I realize, no, it's been held from me. It's been, I paid to see my culture, right? And so there's that complexity around that also we have to think about around the art too, and our exposure to arts and representation, is that people in power actually held that from us because they didn't want us to have it, because that's what instills movements and third world liberation fronts and things like that, to give us that power to unify ourselves. Because if we have the art to express ourselves and to amplify our voices, that's where we hear each other and that's where we get strength. But then they want us to pay for it so that they can control that power. I'm dropping the mic.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today for the panel. Thank you, folks, for joining us for the event. Speaking of dropping a poem, if you're interested in dropping a poem, thank you for the segue. Speaking of dropping a poem, if you're interested in dropping a poem, our open mic is on Thursday this week, 6 p.m. Out in the courtyard. So come through, drop a poem. But yeah, thank you. And
oh, I also just want to promote, if you are interested in the rest of San Jose State's Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month events, please check our calendar out. It is at bit.ly/SJSU API, all in uppercase, and then I think it's 2023 or 23. But you can find the calendar there, or you can go to Mosaic San Jose State's or San Jose State Mosaic's website. They have the API Heritage Month calendar up.
Also, if you're an if you're an undergraduate student and let's say you're in your first year, second year, or you're transferring, you have not taken your GE requirements for Area F, Ethnic Studies, which is a graduation requirement, please take my class. But other than that, I was going to say minor in Asian American Studies. So what's really beautiful about our Asian American Studies minor is that most of our classes actually meet different GE requirements. So you could meet your Area D requirements, your Area F, your Area S, all by taking Asian American Studies classes. And it's only 5 classes that are needed, up to 15 units. And if you're really into it, you can eventually also, very soon, major in Asian American Studies. So yeah, please check out our website. That's coming soon.
Awesome. Perfect. Thank you, everybody. Yeah, thank you. And, this was exactly what I wanted, was hoping for when we were putting together this panel. This is an amazing discussion, and I hope people take stuff away from this. So thank you so much. There's Pono Hawaiian food outside. Get food.